The topic is reducing third-party risk, and I'm talking today with Phil Renaud. He is Executive Director of the Risk Institute at The Ohio State University. Phil, welcome.
Thank you, Bob. Happy to be here.
So, what types of, when we're talking about third parties in general, Phil, what types of third parties today represent the greatest risk to global supply chains?
Yeah, when we think about global supply chains and third-party risk or nth-party risk, um, we have to consolidate, I guess, what part of the supply chain we're in. So there's several examples that I've used in the past. A recent survey that we did at the Risk Institute looked at 44% of the companies that we surveyed, and these were hundreds and hundreds of companies surveyed, indicated that some or all of their risk management function will be outsourced. So what does that mean downstream? It also means that other parts of the business are being outsourced as well. So that could be IT, it could be use of truckers or warehouses, and et cetera, et cetera. And all of that creates risk to the business to the extent that they're using an outsourced third party.
Okay, but what are those third parties? Well, first of all, you're talking about a third party to actually provide the risk capability, correct? I mean, you're saying you outsource the risk management program or initiative completely to an outside party? Is that?
That's right. That's
okay.
Right. We found that 44% of the companies surveyed actually outsourced risk management as well.
Right. Interesting. Of course, I would hope and think that that means you still have somebody in your organization with the title of risk manager, or at least someone who assumes that connection with the outsourced partner so that you have some capability in-house of, at least somebody,
That is
right?
correct. Yeah, that is correct. I mean, many organizations and most organizations are not going to run bare.
Mm-hmm.
They will have some functional area, whether it be the CFO, the treasurer, a senior finance executive having responsibility for risk, but the actual day-to-day operational side of that may be transferred to a third party.
Okay, so that is a type of third party itself. You're outsourcing the risk aspect, but the risk from other third parties is what that outsourced risk body is managing for you. So what
That's
are
exactly.
some of those other types of third parties that constitute the biggest risk to organizations today?
So let's think about that. Let's think about sole source vendors, for example. You may outsource a component part to a finished good, right? So let's say an electronic component to a third party in Asia. And that particular entity is the sole provider of that component part. We've seen that in recent examples with Ford in the F-150 line. I've been involved in operational challenges with organizations that have outsourced pieces and parts of their final good. And that entity had a fire. And the fire took down all production capabilities and required not only a modification to the production capability, but a complete modification to the supply chain. Because the next capable vendor, for example, was not in Asia. It ended up being in Europe. So the supply chain had to be completely modified to make sure that those component parts were going to the factories, ultimately making the final product.
Right.
So other examples of that may be temporary labor. So I'm running a warehouse facility and I'm trying to adjust for peaks and valleys in my demand for particular clients. So I've got a base of employees working in that facility, but I also need to meet peak demands for seasonal adjustments, for example, say Christmas. That requires the use of a third-party labor provider. Well, it's very, very critical that that entity manage that third-party labor provider, particularly in this day and age, to make sure that you've got the proper oversight to the people coming into the workforce. Do they have the requisite training? Is someone monitoring for COVID and other risks that the organization may face?
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems like an obvious thing, and in fact, there is a certain amount of conventional wisdom that says that if you are single source, you should diversify your supply base. Don't be single sourced. Have a B supplier somewhere else in the world. But I imagine that isn't always possible. That
Yeah.
sometimes the type of component being produced is so specialized that there really is only one supplier. To what extent is it impossible to multi-source and then having to deal with the consequences of single sourcing?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly that's an aspect of it, but I mean, we've got to look at cost. We've got to look at other factors in the wider supply chain and the wider production capabilities. But I would also believe that it is possible to have other vendor sources. I mean, every organization needs to have a resilient structure, whether that resilient structure is from component part manufacturers or warehouse capabilities, transportation capabilities, understanding what impacts weather and other dynamics can play on that business. Resilience in the supply chain is a very important part of what organizations are doing and how they're planning.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so if at all possible, definitely multi-sourcing or some aspect of diversification in your supply base is definitely to be desired.
Or at
However,
least, make sure that you've identified other
right,
suppliers in
right.
situations that I've been involved in. Those organizations hadn't even thought about the impact of a risk on their business, so they hadn't thought about other suppliers that could produce that particular component.
That's rather shocking, though,
It
Bill,
is.
is it
I mean,
not?
it's
Given
surprising.
the proliferation of disruptions of all kinds over the last decade or more, would you not think that they would be thinking about that?
You would think so, but there's sometimes a false sense of security that says, well, I've been working with vendor X or a
Mhm.
group of vendors, and it's been a 20-year relationship, and that 20-year relationship has been working out just fine. And therefore, what could happen, right? What are the risks to me? It's been fine for 20 years or so. And then suddenly, an event that takes down the organization or a component part of the organization occurs, and people are running around going, what should I do now? Where do I go? Who do I
Right.
speak to? What are the alternative sources? But more importantly, does that alternative source, one, have the capacity to take you on as a new client, right?
Yeah.
There's probably 10 people ahead of you that have thought through the process, and now you're coming in asking for capacity.
In a crisis, suddenly you're showing up at their door and saying, help me. And they're saying, well, I've had these other customers who have been with me all along. Why should I help you? So,
Exactly.
yeah,
Yeah. I
yeah,
mean, that may be an over dramatization, but at the end of the day, those things do occur.
right. Now, you used a couple of words I want to delve into when it comes to actually managing. You said manage and oversight of the third
Mm-hmm.
party, let's say of the chief third party, whether that's an outsourced activity or not. What does management and oversight of that party consist of?
Yeah, I mean, there's four areas that we have guided and focused on. One is a robust risk assessment. Okay, so is there a sufficient need to justify the retention of a third party? Do I understand what that third party is providing in their capabilities? Right, so that's the risk assessment component. The next is risk monitoring. So putting a process in place to make sure that after the initial assessment, after the initial risk assessment, that we have a continuing review process. Is the third party acting in accordance with the agreement that you've put forth? Are services, product, and or other exposure areas aligned with the intent? Third area is auditing and training. So third-party relationships are subject to audit and compliance checks.
Mm-hmm.
And thinking of a banking exposure, some of those are federal regulations. So do we have internal and external audit guidelines developed and implemented to make sure that that relationship is operating in the proper framework? And then lastly, making sure that you've got a formal record keeping system so that all work towards compliance must be recorded and monitored in the case of demand for those records at some point during the relationship.
That's a tall order that you just described. You're talking about the need to have expertise in finance, in procurement, in security, in human rights, and corporate social responsibility. All of those pieces of expertise can reside in the same entity, the same risk management body or person, or do you have to
No.
call on multiple disciplines in order to do that?
Yeah, and I think, Bob, risk in the 21st century is very different because it's a complicated set of circumstances and requires the investment and the involvement of multiple parties within the organization.
Right.
When I first got into risk, it tended to be viewed as a singular responsibility, so a person or a department.
Sure.
Now, what we see is the risk management is everyone's responsibility in the organization. And we need multiple parties to be involved in these types of transactions. So it's legal, it's human resources, it's traditional risk management, it's finance, it's the CFO's office, it's treasury. But more importantly, if a public company, it's a board oversight as well. So that the board understands fully what risks are present and how those risks are being mitigated, whether they be first party or third party risk.
Yeah, but do you recommend, though, with that in mind, that there still be a single individual, perhaps with the title of Chief Risk Officer, I don't know, who
Yes,
coordinates all those efforts internally?
yes, agree with that fully. But CRO is really the party that should be coordinating these activities through the
Mhm.
organization. So the
Okay.
quarterback, so to speak, of a compliance effort.
Right. Okay. Well, look, that's Phil Renaud of the Risk Institute at The Ohio State University. Some great advice for companies going forward on how to manage third-party risk, sometimes with the help of a third party, ironically. But even so, some very important things that the companies need to be continuing to do internally. So, Phil, thanks very much for being with us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Bob. My pleasure.